Desenvolveu vários projetos de investigação para o Comitê Sindical Europeu de Educação e para a Internacional de Educação. É coautor e autor de vários estudos de investigação, mas é coautor de um livro que eu tenho aqui, que ele teve a amabilidade de oferecer e que gostava de partilhar convosco, que chama-se Lessons in Organizing, What Trade Unionists Can Learn from the War on Teachers. E é um livro e uma reflexão a várias vozes que se baseia muito no que foi aqui na experiência do Reino Unido, de que a Mary nos falou, do que o sindicato, este sindicato NIU tem vindo a fazer, as dinâmicas que tem vindo a desenvolver, a forma como tem crescido e tem criado aqui alguma dinâmica diferente da que acontece em muitos países, em muitos sindicatos. É um livro, como alguém diz aqui, de quem se pronuncia sobre o livro, que é ao mesmo tempo uma lição de história e um guia de organização prático para o futuro. É um livro que os sindicalistas, nós enquanto sindicalistas e também enquanto educadores, devemos ter em conta. Por isso, eu queria dizer que é com muito prazer que temos a possibilidade de ter aqui o professor Stevenson. Tive a oportunidade de o ouvir várias vezes, em várias iniciativas internacionais. Tinha muita vontade de trazer cá. Tínhamos o problema da tradução, que não é fácil quando se fala outra língua. Este foi o momento ideal para trazer, uma vez que tínhamos tradução simultânea. Foi possível integrá-lo já numa fase posterior. Chegou ontem à noite, regressa daqui a pouco para a Irlanda, onde tem um outro congresso amanhã. Ainda por cima não almoçou. Vamos ver se... You haven't had lunch, so hopefully you won't faint. Vamos ver se não desmaia no final. Mas enfim, é com muito gosto que o temos aqui e eu dou-lhe aqui a palavra. You have the floor, Howard. Thank you very much for coming.
Colleagues, it's a real pleasure to be here to mark what feels like a very historic event and to be part of your 40th anniversary. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really honoured to receive it and to be part of your proceedings. I do recognise we're coming to the end of a long day. For me, it's been absolutely fascinating, but it's always hard work to be concentrating sometimes when there's translation going on. So I appreciate you've been working very hard. I'm grateful for you still working with me today through to the end of the day. I'll try not to take too much time saying things that have already been said, but what I do want to do is pick up on lots of the themes that have been raised through the day and maybe try to give us some new ways of thinking about some old problems. It gives me an opportunity to bring together two aspects of research that I'm engaged in. Some of that is around the issues of teacher supply, and we've talked a lot today about valuing the teaching profession. I've been fortunate to work with a colleague of mine, Alison Milner, on a project for European colleagues around the attractiveness of the teaching profession, and I will share some of that work. Oh, thank you very much, that's very kind. And that will link then into the second theme that I think has come through very strongly today, and particularly this afternoon, which is the importance of strong trade unions to make the change happen that we so desperately need. But to start with, if I may, and by way of some context, I think we live in difficult and dangerous times. I'm going to call it an age of crises. economic crisis, public health crisis, geopolitical crisis, environmental crisis, democratic crisis. Teachers didn't create these crises. You're not responsible for these crises. Anyone or any one of us on our own cannot fix these crises. But every single one of these crises comes into your classroom in some way every single day. The economic crisis of 2008 and the austerity that followed affected education almost more than any other public service. And what we know, of course, and I appreciate particularly in Portugal, and what we know is that even now, investment levels in many European countries have not returned to their 2008 levels. So the effect of that austerity is experienced in your classrooms with the resources that you have to do the job that you need to do. We know that COVID-19 completely transformed the way that you had to do your work. Is there another occupation to make such a dramatic sort of transformation of work practices in order to make sure that young people still, in some form and in the most difficult circumstances, receive some form of education? And on many of these other issues, the war that we see in Europe and indeed beyond Europe, the environmental crisis, the democratic crisis, we heard about the fake news, but the rise of a dangerous populism, an anti-science, sometimes an anti-politics, the power of social media, all of these things shaping the lives of young people, the people who you teach, all of these crises making a difficult job, the job of teaching, much more difficult. And so of all these crises, the one I haven't mentioned is the crisis of teacher supply. Because the challenges that teachers are now experiencing, and of course we've heard a lot about it throughout the day, are inevitably impacting on people's willingness to continue to do this work. This is a quote from the European Commission. If I overuse the word crisis, which I may do, I'm not using the word crisis in this context. These are the words of the European Commission. And if I read just some of it out, because I appreciate the language issues, many European education systems are now suffering from shortages. This can significantly hinder the delivery of quality teaching and learning. The teacher shortage problem is experienced across Europe. As Haldis made clear this morning, actually, and to use the language of UNESCO, it is a global crisis of teacher supply. They know it's a crisis, and they know it is affecting the quality of teaching and learning. But what we heard in the presentations this afternoon is that in a sense it's not enough for some of these people to know these things, because that does not necessarily lead to the action that is required to address the problems. What we argue in the report is that this is a crisis of teacher supply, the likes of which we actually have not seen before. But before I just develop that point a bit more, let me just show you some of the European Commission's own data about shortages across Europe. It's not necessary to sort of try to identify all the individual countries. This is a list of countries that are identified, and this is data is actually pre-pandemic. This is a list of countries that are identified as facing the teacher shortage problem. We just need to recognise there's a lot of countries in that list. It's difficult to generalise. We've heard today the nature of that problem looks different in different places. In some cases, the problem is attracting new people into the profession. In other countries, and we've heard about it this afternoon, the difficulty is retaining people in the profession. Sometimes it's both of those things working together. There's a significant number of countries, I think Portugal is one of them, identified as having an ageing teaching population. A significant number of people in the next 5 or 10 years will be retiring, and there is no evidence that sufficient new recruits into teaching, that there will be sufficient recruits in sufficient numbers to replace this big wave of people who are going to be retiring. So really significant problems. What we argue in the report is that the crisis that we're facing now is maybe different to the ones we've experienced in the past. It's certainly going to be more long-lasting unless there is radical action to bring about change. So let me just sort of give us a way of thinking about the problems that we've been talking about. And the things that I'm going to talk about are things that in a sense we've been referring to all day. I'm not going to spend time on the detail. You've heard people explain this with specific examples from specific countries and in a sense giving much better examples than I'm going to do here. So I'm going to do this really quite briefly. But what I want to demonstrate is why the problems that we're experiencing now are likely to last a long time in the future unless there is radical, ambitious action to bring about change. How to think about the problem, right? This is a sort of really easy way of thinking about things, but let me just set it down. 3 factors. First issue, pay, remuneration, the importance of pay. I don't need to say anything about that. I think it's self-evident, but I'll say more about pay later. The second issue is the work, the nature of the work itself. Important because, of course, it links very, very closely to any sense of job satisfaction. So the nature of the work and the job satisfaction experienced, very important consideration. And then the third factor, working conditions. Almost in a sense, everything else. And we've heard lots of references today to working conditions. What I would just say is the important point about working conditions is they sort of work in 2 ways. They have an impact on our ability to do the work in the way that we want to do the work. So, do I feel able to do the job in the way that I think it should be done? That depends on my working conditions. But working conditions, of course, also help me balance my life in work with my life outside of work. So if I'm to have work-life balance, as we say, then actually my working conditions is an important determinant of what that work-life balance looks like. So, pay, remuneration, the work, working conditions. 3 factors. You're obviously super familiar with them. Let me say, I think how these things have worked in the past and how these things are changing now. How have these things worked in the past? Right, and I'm going to generalise across Europe, which is a dangerous thing to do because there are obviously very significant differences. We've had a flavour of that this afternoon, but I think you can make some broad generalisations about common features in many countries. What has happened historically, I think, is there has been a sort of uneasy equilibrium between these 3 factors. Let me explain what I mean. Pay. Across most European countries, pay pay for teachers is below graduate average earnings. Right? In the vast majority of countries, pay for teachers is below graduate average earnings. Teaching requires a lot of graduates. Right? It's a big profession. It requires a lot of graduates. If you need to recruit a lot of graduates and you pay below graduate average earnings, you will have problems. Right? That's not Nobel Prize winning economics. That is really basic stuff. And in most countries, pay is below graduate average earnings, despite the demand for teachers. In countries where pay is close to graduate average earnings, typically we don't see recruitment problems on the same scale. So pay is a problem. But the work, as we all know, has the potential to offer, to provide high levels of job satisfaction. It can do that because teaching is creative, it's varied, it's challenging, it has social purpose, it has the potential to make a difference. You recognise all these factors. There are aspects of the work that mean that it ought to give us high levels of job satisfaction. And if we look at working conditions in teaching, I don't want to suggest that everything in the past was fine, because it certainly wasn't. But if you look at working conditions in teaching, what I want to say is that the picture is actually quite mixed. And although there are some aspects of working conditions that have been real problems in many countries, there are some aspects of the working conditions of teachers that might be considered relatively favourable around the working year and how that is organised. And in a profession that is typically 75% female, and where women still do the majority of caring, there are significant issues. So historically, I think that's how this sort of uneasy equilibrium has operated. Poor pay, but maybe the potential for high levels of job satisfaction, and working conditions that have some positive features. So what's happening now? Well, pay is still poor. Pay is still a problem. You're involved in action, I think, over pay. We've heard today about unions taking action over pay. It's a problem that continues, and of course it has been compounded by the cost of living crisis. What about work? Well, levels of job satisfaction are declining. And I think we can attribute this to a shift in many of the contexts in which we work, a shift from what we might broadly call high trust cultures towards low trust cultures. So there is more pressure now on teachers to be able to demonstrate and prove just to prove that you're doing the work that you're supposed to be doing, but often to be able to demonstrate that pupils are making the progress that is expected of them. So as those expectations increase, as that trust diminishes, two things happen. One, as teachers, you experience less and less control over your own work. And secondly, in order to meet these expectations, you find yourself engaged in more and more administration and bureaucracy. So of course what's going on is that the things that give you satisfaction in work, to be able to engage in the challenge of teaching, that becomes diminished because you lose control over the work that you're doing, whilst at the same time you experience an increase in workload. And I think this is what we're seeing across the teaching profession, across Europe, but actually beyond Europe. It's a really, really significant problem. And then the third issue, working conditions. I said before that it was mixed. Maybe there were some aspects of working conditions that were relatively attractive. I think we've seen that start to change significantly. And what we have to remember about the labour market is that when someone makes a choice to come into teaching, they have other options to consider as well. And what I think we're seeing in occupations outside of teaching is a better ability to provide attractive working conditions and more flexible forms of working than was previously the case. And this has accelerated since the pandemic, when many employers have realised that they can offer more flexible forms of working, that sometimes they can offer working from home, that there are ways of rethinking what work might look like, and it is able to do that, offer very attractive working conditions in some instances. And workers aren't just as productive as they were before, in many cases they're more productive. So what we're seeing in teaching is a relative decline in working conditions relative to the options available in other sectors. And these are long-term changes. If we think about the three issues, pay is a problem. It always has been a problem, and in a sense, real change won't come about until the pay issue is tackled. But pay has always been a problem, but the other aspects of this uneasy equilibrium, the work is declining and the working conditions are declining, particularly when compared to other occupations. So that makes the crisis that we face now, I think, qualitatively different to the sorts of crises that we may have faced in the past, which were often quite closely linked to economic cycles. Nothing is going to auto-correct this situation. This situation will not be changed unless there is radical action on all or some of these issues. Improving pay, reversing the trend in our work to diminished trust, so increasing the trust levels, returning the professional autonomy, recreating the space for creativity. A vision of teaching that I heard described this morning by the professor. And a set of working conditions that compare favourably to working conditions in other occupations. All of those things require really profound, radical change. I've heard the word again this morning, ambitious change, audacious change. It's what it needs. It's what crises require. But listening to people this afternoon, not really a sense that the political action and the political will follows the understanding of the problem. So I want to suggest that none of this change is possible without strong, powerful trade unions making that change happen. It is the only thing that is going to create the pressure that brings about the change. So what I want to do in the time that I've got remaining is just to sort of link what I've been talking about to this notion of trade union renewal, we sometimes call it, or revitalisation. How do we build the unions that can bring about the change that we need? And this draws on work that I've done with EI, which is the publication on the left. I don't know whether these slides will get circulated, but I'm happy if they do, and they've got links in them. Work I did with Education International, work that I did with the European Trade Union Committee, the one in the middle, and then the third publication is the most recent one, which Manuela referred to. It's a book I've written with some colleagues around experience of the NEU, the National Education Union in the UK. And of course you've heard from Mary talking very eloquently about the work that's gone on there. What the book tries to do in a sense is to tell that story. And we call it Lessons in Organising. They're not instructions, it's not a manual. They're lessons that I hope we can learn from. We have to collectively, as a trade union movement that crosses borders, get better at learning from each other. This is what today has been about, and it's what we need to do more of. What I would just say, before I say something about the lessons themselves, is this isn't just an academic interest for me, it's an activist interest as well. I am a member of my trade union. Since 2018, we have been on strike for 69 days for pay and for pensions and for workload reform. So when Trudy was talking about persistence, it sort of, I rather felt that I knew what persistence felt like, because it's been a long struggle, but it just may be that we're about to achieve a significant breakthrough. So what I want to do in conclusion is just say something about the three lessons that we identify in this book, and which I hope might resonate with yourselves and give you a way of thinking about the work that you're involved in. And this will just take a short moment. So lesson number one, we talk about organising in the workplace. I know that looks different in different countries. Mary talks about the importance of the school rep, the just ordinary union member in a school, but who other members of the union agree should be the representative of the union in the school. When that person exists, when there is someone in the workplace who does that work, it's almost breathing life into the union organisation. That's the point at which there is something there for other members to identify with, that actually it becomes part of their collective identity. What we know is we can never just assume solidarity. We can never assume that people are going to sort of work together in the way that we might want. There has to be a focus for that. There has to be something that gives it life. And having somebody in the workplace who does that work becomes the focal point of that activity. Ordinary members in ordinary schools, it's not a great phrase to use, but ordinary members in ordinary schools. When that exists, that's when they see and feel the union. That's when they belong. And if we want to build those cultures of solidarity, it requires relentlessly focusing on the workplace. But that's not enough. And in all these publications that I've just identified, I've used the phrase organising around ideas. Simply the notion that we can't simply be against, but that we have also to be for something. And we have to be able to articulate what that alternative is. We heard this morning about not speaking up is equal to consent. And I'm reminded sometimes that when we don't talk about things enough, it's not sometimes that people consent to things actively, but they can't necessarily imagine what the alternative is. And organising around ideas is the work I think we have to put in as trade unionists to articulate what those alternatives might look like. And the quick example I'm going to give you, and I'm going to embarrass Mary possibly now, but it's the work that her union has done around the inspection regime. The inspection regime in England, which has been in place for 30 years, is deeply resented by the vast majority of teachers. It's absolutely abundantly clear it's what drives the increase in workload and which has fed into the recruitment and retention problems that we experience in the system. At this moment, that regime looks more fragile and more vulnerable than it probably ever has. And there's quite a campaign to reform it, change it, abolish it, replace it. There's a lot of pressure for change. Mary's union, and Mary in particular, because she wrote a book about this, but is also well known for speaking on the issue, is someone who has consistently highlighted the issue and been able to articulate that issue, not just as one of critique, but one about alternative possibilities. And there's just now the possibility that that change may come about. But if that work doesn't take place, those moments don't get realised. So we have to be able to, I think, do the work to articulate alternatives. It's the work I heard in the presentation from the professor this morning about what the type of teaching is that we really believe in and what that can look like. But we have to put that work in. The third lesson, and very briefly, I've called it here Organise the Organisers. In the book, we say leadership matters, and it's not thinking about leaders maybe in the traditional way as the people who lead our organisations, important work though that is. It's thinking about how do we distribute and share leadership across the organisation, and in particular, thinking about leadership as the responsibility to draw others into the organisation and to develop leadership capacity in others. So the activism that matters is the activism that develops activism in others. We cannot rely on our organisations carrying on existing in the way that they historically have. We all know that there are challenges that are making that more difficult. We've heard examples, we've seen examples this afternoon of spectacular things that are going on, and your own strikes are further examples of that. But we need to think harder about what we actively do to rebuild, to build and rebuild our organisations. We can't assume that these things are just going to happen. And that's part of that sort of mutual learning. So sort of three things to think about. What does the union look like to ordinary members in ordinary schools? The importance of having that presence in the workplace. The ability to articulate alternatives, that we're not just against something, but we can never argue what we are in favour of. And thinking more actively about what it is that we do that helps regenerate the organisations that we're part of. And so in conclusion, I think these, as I said earlier on, are difficult and dangerous times. In an age of crises, we need strong and united unions. And in my time in Portugal for 24 hours, I've heard a lot of talk about the need for trade union unity. We've heard from 2 instances today of countries where unions have joined together. And I think there's some interesting lessons for all of us there. But the need for strong unions is not just the teachers, it's for students, it's for democracy, and it's for society. This is the work that you have been engaged in for 40 years. And if I may finish with a quote from the British trade union movement, we say, "The past we inherit, the future we build." I wish you every success building and shaping the future. Thank you very much for your time.